Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are going to talk about getting started with PBIS today. And my name is Heather George from the University of South Florida. I co-direct the National Center on PBIS as well as our state project in Florida for PBIS. And I have my colleague here, Dr. Stephanie Martinez, who's also going to be presenting and talking to you guys today. We've got a series of polls that we would like you guys to complete while we are talking. Please use the chat box as you're going, because we want to try to make this as interactive as possible. All of the information that we're covering today is going to be updated or is all in the file box on that Pathables. So again, if you have questions, and as a reminder, our expectations for working virtually of being responsible, respectful, and safe overall, and how to use the chat tabs, and we want to make sure to use inclusive and respectful language. And again, your agenda, obviously you're here. You've used your agenda to get here, and how to navigate the different sessions, how to navigate the chat and polls, questions and answers. All of that information has been uploaded into the handouts, so you could always refer to it. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But the biggest fear, I think, is accidentally navigating away, because it can create an open window if you do move away from the Pathable app. But don't worry, sometimes it's much easier to get back to than you think. And just know that there's the help desk at the top of your browser on the Pathable that will be there to assist you in this process. So I'm unable to see the chat box for some reason right now, but we're not going to worry about that because I'm going to move forward and my presenters will stop me otherwise. But I want you to think about, a lot of you, you're coming here individually. You might be sitting with a group of people right now, hopefully socially distancing. But if you have folks that are team members that are also participating in this process, but you might be at different sites, I want you to think about you're still a team, even though you might not be sitting around a table right now together. And when you're going through this information that we're sharing with you, I want you to think about how this information, how does it compare to your current priorities that you have on your school campus? What would you do to make this work on your school campus or within your district? Where you think this work, who would be most responsible? Like, where would it be housed overall? Some folks put it in their climate, some have a discipline area, some have overall their general, but to think about what would make most sense. Because one size does not fit all. We need to be flexible in how we're implementing. And what should we stop doing to make room for this? So the one thing we want to think about going into this new information is we want to make sure that we are not duplicating efforts. We want to make sure that we're not adding more to our plate. And at times it might feel like we are adding more to our plate, but the issue is we're adding more to our plate to temporarily figure out how do we take all this other stuff off and be able to respond, prevent more problem behavior, and respond proactively and quickly if behavior does occur. And then thinking about how are we going to assess to make sure how well we're doing things. So today we're going to talk to you about how to identify and define PBIS, as well as describe the rationale for implementing. I'll be spending most of the time on that, but then Stephanie's going to get into the hardcore nitty-gritty, show you specific examples of what it means for next steps to start implementing PBIS. So in case you're wondering, where's a quick go-to for this information? So if you go to our National Center site at pbis.org, there's a button at the top, PBIS. You can go straight to getting started, and a lot of the information that we're covering today can be housed there. So if you haven't had a chance already to look at the polls, if you could look at poll number 1, I'm curious to find out from you how many of you are working primarily either with students, as school administrators. This is essentially what is your main job responsibility, because I know we all have all kinds of hats overall. But if you could go in and complete that, and then I will show you what the results are looking like. and all of you may not have completed it, but if you can see my screen right now, it looks like 46% of you are working with students and their families, so I'm assuming you're at that educator teacher role, but we have 24% as school administrators, 20% at the district level, and 7% in the other categories. So out of curiosity is to, what that other category is, if you could type that into the chat box, that would be great. Okay, another question I have for you is poll number 2. So how many of you have been supporting schools? They're just starting their first year of implementing PBIS, or you've been going to be supporting schools that have been implementing for at least up to 5 years. This may not be you per se who has been doing this, but you're going in to support a school that has been engaging in PBIS for some time. And if you can complete poll number 2, if you haven't already. And looking just very quickly, and it's perfectly fine if you're still filling these results out. You can see that most are just starting their first full year of implementation, which makes perfect sense why you're in the getting started with PBIS. But you've got some schools that you're going to be supporting that have been implementing at least for up to 5 years. So that starts getting into this, they're more fluent. And if you are not one of those people who've been implementing for 5 years, but your school has, just know that there is a way. We are also learning as we're going. And so there's a way that we want you to become familiar with all the tools that are available. So when they're looking at you as the expert to help them out, you won't feel completely left in the dark. And it's perfectly fine to still be thinking about it if you're not quite sure. If you want to implement it, or knowing all that's involved with PBIS. So let's talk quickly about what PBIS is, just to make sure that we're clear on the foundation. But essentially, we're looking at creating a school that's supports success for everybody. And when I talk about everybody, we want teachers to be successful. We want all the staff that are working there to be successful. We obviously want kids to be successful, and we want parents to be happy with the quality of education that they're getting for their children. But we're looking at how do we engage in this problem-solving process to lay this foundation so that kids that may need more intensive supports, or classroom teachers that might need more intensive supports for various reasons, we're able to get that to them quickly and more efficiently. So let's talk quickly about that. Some of these big ideas, we want to think about what our outcomes are and what our outcomes would like to be. So obviously, most of us want safe schools. We want kids to be learning as much as possible to their fullest potential. We want teachers to be enjoying their jobs and feeling like they're seeing that student success so that they continue to be reinforced in what they're doing. And how we go about that is we've got to examine our data. What do the data tell us? And what do our practices, what have we been engaging in? And what do we need to change within our systems? And we start to adjust our systems, it's going to adjust our practices. It has to. And we use our data to guide and gauge how we're doing so that we can provide the most equitable education for all kids across the board, regardless of their needs. And that leads to how we're engaging in our practices. It's connecting with our folks through the relationships. It's using our data to screen and catch kids early who need the most support. It's providing that support. It's teaching kids not just the academic, but teaching them that behavioral, those social emotional expectations. If you're struggling or you're anxious, here's a way to identify it, but here's a way in which to go about to cope with that, to work through that, how to reach out to an adult in that process. And then using that data, we're monitoring as we're going to see, are kids practicing these new skills that we've been teaching them? Are we doing a good job in helping them with these long life skills? Oh, I've got another poll. I didn't even realize that. So if you get a chance, if you could go to poll 3, and some of the goals of PBIS, I'm curious about what your goals are overall at your school. But the goals of PBIS is we want to create an effective, positive school environment. The goal is we want to improve the academic behavioral outcomes for all students. We want to prevent, obviously, as much problem behaviors from occurring. We need to work together as a team to collaborate. We've got to use our data to make decisions. And therefore, then we need to teach and reinforce the students. So teach them what we expect, and let's reinforce them when they use these new skills so that we can be responsive across the board. So if you could look at poll 3 and to fill it out, and which of these goals would you like most in your school? I'm guessing everybody would like all of them, but which one would you like most? And I will show you what the results of that are. So as you can see, the highest one is to teach and reinforce appropriate behavior through that multi-tiered system support. That's the highest one. The second highest is improve the academic behavioral outcomes for all students. And again, if you want to be able to, if you want to continue completing those, please go ahead and do so. So let's talk about PBIS as that multi-tiered behavioral framework, what that looks like. And we talk about a multi-tiered approach. We're looking at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I'm sure you guys have heard about that before. But tier 1, when we're looking at it, it's meaning everybody. This is the foundation across the board. And the foundation is what we're talking about everybody's accessing. So it's not just all students, it's all the adults too. It's all the family members. And then we look at tier 2, who needs supplemental supports, a little bit more overall. They're still accessing that foundation of tier 1. But then tier 3, this is those who may need most intensive support. So it's not just students that need most intensive supports, it's also, there's some families that we have that we know need more intensive supports. We've got some teachers that might need more intensive supports, whether it's the groups of students that they have in their classroom, whether it's they may be a newer teacher and are struggling. It could be that they're located right next to the lunchroom and they're cooking great stuff all the time. The kids are distracted like crazy. But this is how we start to tier the different supports that we're providing overall. I think the thing that's most important is to know is to have the most success. We know we've got to start at that foundation at tier 1. Problem solving never stops whatsoever. So we're always engaging and looking at our data and identifying what the problem is and coming up with a solution for it and monitoring if that solution that we came up with actually worked. And it's all based on this prevention logic. So when we're looking at tier 1, we're talking about establishing that foundation. So it's these procedures for teaching and practicing expected behaviors across the settings. We're going to encourage the appropriate behaviors that we see that we just taught. And we're also going to come up with procedures to discourage. Remember, we're going to try to prevent as much as possible from happening. We're going to use our data for decision making, and then we need to get families aware and involved in what we're doing, because they can also help support for example, being respectful at home and what that might look like. Some things for you guys to know. When you're looking at the files in our handouts, you can click directly on these icons here, and it will take you directly to that resource. But some of the stuff we've created in Florida is just kind of this, what is this one-stop shop that I can get this quick information. So if I'm wanting to get PBIS up in my school, if I'm wanting to get parents involved, if I'm wanting to get more schools in my district involved with this, what's like a one-page flyer that can kind of help give me that information to spark people's interest. And so we've created a bunch of these overall, but it's important to know that PBIS is a framework and it's not a curriculum, it's not a program whatsoever, but it's a framework. So it makes sense in what you're doing. How you fill it with the content is based upon the needs of your school. So let's talk about why PBIS. And I think the lava lamp, I know it clearly dates me, and you guys can probably figure out what era, what decade I grew up in. But the lava lamp, I look at us as we're in this blue, and kids, teachers, classrooms, families are moving up and down the lava lamp. There's times we need more support. There's times we don't need as much support. But knowing how can we be responsive to provide supports to folks when they need it. We know that schools are facing these difficult challenges. There's multiple expectations. Kids aren't always coming to school ready. to learn. And so there's a lot of prerequisites that we have to provide that we may not have planned originally to have to do, especially with everything that's been going on this past year. We've got a lot more students coming from families that are struggling. And we've also learned over time that these traditional get tough approaches have proven to be ineffective overall. So, and lack of discipline, that very last bullet is viewed as one of the most serious challenges facing public schools and one of the #1 reasons why teachers are leaving the profession. So we've got to think about how can we maintain our personnel on our campus. We also know that most of us, how we went to school is you misbehave, you got a consequence for that. So our common responses to problem behavior is that exclusion and that punishment piece. We also know that hardening schools to prevent violence actually tends to have a bit of a backfires on us and doesn't necessarily produce those as safe environments as we had hoped. Not saying that they all don't work. There are pieces of it that are absolutely important, but they can't be the only pieces that we do. So thinking of our traditional discipline, we want that behavior to stop right away. But when we're looking at bringing in positive behavior support, remember PBIS is based on the science of positive behavior support, we're looking at reducing that undesirable behavior by altering the environment, teaching appropriate skills, acknowledging the students and the adults when they engage in those appropriate skills, and using our data to identify and prevent and get supports early for folks. So I'm guessing this might feel like this is you, whether you're a classroom teacher, you're an administrator, you're in a district, or you're in a state. We know that it is initiative central. Like people are nonstop. There's all kinds of things that we have to do, and trying to figure out how do we what do we do first? What's most important? And it's perfectly natural to feel overwhelmed in this process. But as we know that sometimes more doesn't always mean that it's better. So a quick poll that I want to ask you guys again is #4 of which of these 5 different things here are you experiencing? And you can choose multiple responses to this. I'm going to show you what those results are looking like so far on that poll. Most of you have at least more than one of the above that you're saying, and that multiple initiatives are being implemented without collaborative planning. Yep. And I'm not surprised that was your answer, and I'm sorry that was your answer. So let's talk about what we can do to try to help streamline things. So when we have shared values of coming together, why are we doing what we're doing? I want you to think about, regardless of what level you're at, a classroom, a school, a district, or even at a state, what do you value? What do you want to accomplish and build? And what skills and resources are needed to achieve your goals? And so from that can help create a vision. And so I think there's a lot of folks that we come into PBIS with a different angle, whether if we're that classroom teacher and we're saying, we need this, I need positive behavior support in my classroom. I might not have my administrator bought in yet, but what I envision for my classroom is I want my kids on task. I want them to feel safe, that they can come and ask me questions. If they're struggling, we can talk about it so we can get back to work and continue improving our academics. And that's just an example of a vision. An administrator might be, I'd love all of my teachers to have strong relationships with their students. We'd like to be getting kids the help they need early without them having to misbehave and telling us, oh, this is highlighting for us, we need to provide supports. But you've got to talk about that. And it's important, the more you bring your stakeholders in, they need to have a voice in being able to create that vision, whether it's your classroom, it's your school, it's your district, or your state. So thinking about what is your vision overall for your school. And how do we do this? It's that foundation at Tier 1 that's going to create that safe and orderly environment. That vision is going to help you communicate to folks to get more folks on board for this. People need to provide access for opportunities to build these skills. They may need to know what's code switching, because what will keep them alive, say on the weekends, how are they supposed to act differently when they show up at the school? We need the data to guide problem solving. We need to understand that well-being and that there's a diverse team approach. We've got to collaborate because there's a lot of us working on this together. We don't need to be duplicating efforts, but we also have to be willing to do things differently. So some of the things to give you guys a heads up nationally, this was as of August of last year, we had over 27,000 schools that are reporting into our national database for the Center for PBIS. We just ran the numbers literally this morning, and it's well over 29,000 that are reporting into the national database. That is about 16 million students that we're directly impacting. It's over 30% of our US schools across the board. Of course, everybody's implementing at different levels of fidelity, but what's important is that folks are saying, we know that if we implement with fidelity, the research has shown over the years that we will have improved student outcomes, reduced disciplinary exclusion, as well as improved teacher outcomes. So I want you to think about doing the math overall here. If you have 1,000 office discipline referrals, you reduce them by 35%. May not seem like that big of a deal, but actually you gain over 43 instructional days by reducing office discipline referrals by 35%. What that means for the administrators is it means you regain 58 hours, or that equates to a total of almost 10 days that you get back on a 6-day hour on the average, which I have yet to ever meet an educator or administrator who only had a 6-hour day. But that's why we want to work on preventing as much problem behavior from occurring. Some of you might collect climate data, and this might be one way to start. You've got your climate data overall. You're seeing, this is an example from one district across all of their elementary schools that they have. And they're seeing that overall, there's a small percentage of elementary students that are still experiencing bullying incidents, but that 20% of actually the students from middle and high school in this district report having seriously considered self-harming within the last 12 months. That's alarming. Reasons for considering self-harm, that they went further on that climate, was because of family reasons that were at home. So it's important that we've got to look at what do the students have to say about the climate across the schools. It's not that we can necessarily fix what's happening at home, but I want you to know we can think of, we need to provide a place that's safe for the kids so that if they're feeling that there's family reasons at home, how can they find an adult at our school to talk to? How can they start to build their skills so that they can cope when they are going back home? So there are things we can do during the school day. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to Stephanie, and she's going to go over pretty awesome stuff with you guys in the details. I'll be paying attention to the chat box and giving her feedback on what the polls are looking like. And I'll talk to you guys after she's done.
Thank you, Heather. So when we look at PBIS, and it's pretty cool, I went back and looked at the poll one more time to see where schools were, participants were with implementation. And I think about 63% of the participants said today that they're either in their first year or they're just exploring, they haven't even implemented PBIS yet. So, a lot of you are at that exploration stage. Heather spent a lot of time going over what is PBIS and why you should be doing it. Hopefully, after several years, 3 to 5 years, you'll be at that full implementation piece, but don't expect there to be overnight. So a lot of you are still at that first stage of exploring, do you want to do PBIS? What does it look like? What would it look like at my school? And starting to put those installation in place. So there's poll 5 that asks you, based on the implementation stages, where you currently are. So if you want to open poll 5 and identify where your school is. Give you a couple more seconds for voting. And so Heather has brought that up. And it looks like what I expected, about 37% of you are exploring right now where you want to be, and about 20% are that initial 32% initial implementation. So majority of you are just at the very beginning stages. Thank you, Heather. Okay, so in order for us to really put PBIS in place, there needs to be some planning and thinking about all of these questions that are coming up on here. So what are the needs of our school and what are some challenges we need to overcome? I love the slide that Heather talked about with all the different initiatives that you're doing. So thinking about, like, is that a challenge that we may come across? How are we going to integrate all of those? What are some strengths that we have at our school? Maybe we have a very strong team at our school. What resources will we need? So reaching out, if you're working with a school, what resources does the district have? Which resources does the state offer for you? So a lot of these questions here to think about when you're starting to implement, but also thinking about how you can get the buy-in from the faculty and staff at your school, but also getting the buy-in from all your stakeholders. So getting input from your families and your students throughout the process as you develop your school-wide system and putting it in place. And ultimately, what do you want to get out of doing PBIS at a tier 1 system? Is it reduction of discipline referrals? Is it improving school climate like the survey that Heather showed? Or is it also to reduce the amount of time kids are out of class to improve academics? So having upfront what those are so you can share those with the stakeholders is really helpful. So what we're going to be talking about here a lot in a few seconds is what does this actually look like when we're implementing a tier 1 system at our school? You really need to have all of these in place, but two of the big keys here is that having that PBIS team, so the leaders at your school who will be leading the efforts, but also stakeholder engagement and getting the feedback and input from all of your stakeholders. When we talk about stakeholders here, we're talking about not just the staff at your school, but we're also talking about families and students as well, so they buy into the process and making sure it's culturally responsive to your school. So steps for getting started. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're going to go through all of them. And so these are these recommendations of the steps to take to actually put PBIS in place at your school. So we're going to give you lots of examples of what this would actually look like if it's being implemented at your school. So let's kind of move forward with each one of those. So the first thing to do to get started is to identify who would be on your team. Who are the staff members at your school that will sit on that PBIS team? We have some suggested team member roles here. A lot of times at our schools in Florida, there's some overlap between some of these positions and roles, but this little activity here will give you a breakdown of what does that role actually look like. And we've broken it down so what the data person looks like before the meeting. So for example, the data person before the meeting would access the graphs from the district data system or SWPBIS or our Florida Schools RTIB. So referrals by time of day, location, look at that, have that ready and available during the meeting. Then during the meeting, they would share the data, have a discussion about it, and maybe other team members have additional questions and they could pull that information and share it. And then again, what you do after the meeting. And so we break this down so everybody knows what their tasks and roles and responsibilities would be. And of course, we know that a lot of our teams meet before and after school, and depending upon that, a snack master might be something that gets people there. I know with us on our staff project, we have one person who bakes cakes, and that's like the thing that we look forward to on our team. So just making sure you have someone that fulfills each of these roles. So what are some of the characteristics of effective teams? So when we think about a good PBIS team, they really need to have all of these things in place. And so we need to make sure that the team has a good understanding of what PBIS is, why they're doing it, and having some goals in place. We want to make sure that when our team is meeting, that there's a good open collaboration amongst our team, and there's what we call balanced participation. So everybody is taking on some tasks and roles. And then making sure that we have a good decision-making process on our team so that if we do come across some hurdles, like we have some disagreements, we have decided as a consensus of how we will come over those disagreements. I've got some schools who do majority rules. I have some that say administrator decides. I even have some schools that will say, we're going to table this and we'll bring it up at the next meeting. But again, the big part of this is making sure that even though we have this effective team, that we continue to bring input from all of our stakeholders. And I'll give you some examples of how some schools have done that. So the first thing is we want to make sure that we have a vision for why we are doing this. A lot of times you might want to go back and look at your mission statement for your school. Think about why you want to do PBIS at your school. So here's a couple of examples, and you'll notice that it's brief and it's a statement of purpose why we're doing it. The next thing is we want to make sure that we have a way to measure if we are implementing PBIS with Fidelity. What's really nice about both the TFI, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, which some states and districts use in schools, or the Benchmarks of Quality, or the BOQ, they really do a nice job of what I like to think of task analyzing what the elements of PBIS are and what they look like. So one of the things that we do here with our schools in Florida is when they start PBIS, they do a benchmarks of quality, which is their baseline, just to kind of see and get an idea of what they already have in place. So if you haven't seen, here are the different samples of what those tools look like. We've got the benchmarks of quality on there. We have an evaluation of the benchmarks of quality, and then the TFI. So here's a sample of the TFI. Again, as Heather said, here are the links for those, and here's some research behind those as well. And thinking about with the evaluation tool, the purpose of that is just to see where you are with implementation and how you are doing with fidelity of implementation. So the TFI does look across tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, but it really gives you an idea of how you are doing with implementation. So we have another poll, poll 6, which asks you, which of the tools does your school use for tier 1 PBIS? So to ask you if it's the benchmarks of quality, the TFI, or you don't even know. Heather wants to show that.
Stephanie, I'll show it in just a second. My screen is spinning right now.
That's okay. She's waiting for that to work. It looks like the majority of individuals are unsure, unknown. So about 63% of the participants today don't know. And then 33% are using the TFI. So if you're unsure, what I would do is suggest you go back and reach out to your district person, your contact, your state person, whoever your contact is for PBIS, and identify which tool that you are using. Then the next thing we want to talk about is coming up with some specific goals based on your vision and mission. And so you can see here are some different samples of what schools have done to come up with what they would like to see at the end of 3 years, what they would like to see at the end of 5 years. One of the things we recommend is try to make it observable and measurable, and something that's realistic as well. So if you're wanting to do something like decreasing office discipline referrals, do you want to do that by 5% at the end of 1 year, and maybe 15% at the end of 3 years? So having that, which is really nice because then you can communicate it back to all your stakeholders. Say, this is our vision, our goals that we want to see at the end of 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. And what's nice about it is then you could continue to update your stakeholders on how you are doing towards reaching that goal. So if the goal is to reduce your office discipline referrals by 5% at the end of year 1, throughout the year, you can say, this is where we were last year, this is where we are currently, and you can do that comparison to let your teams know if you're on track to meet that goal or not. Using some other different data sources can help you. So the benchmarks of quality, that might be something, or the TFI that could help you determine your next steps. They might help you focus in on a specific area that you want to focus in on. So for example, if I were looking at these different schools here, I might want to think about, okay, lesson planning or teaching our expectations and rules might be an area that we want to focus in on. So using multiple data sources to come up with those goals. And then if you're using the TFI, here's the same thing. These are what the results look like, and you could use these as ways to measure and identify those goals. And then what we want to do is make sure we're action planning. So after we have had our team meeting, we want to put in there, when we've met and looked and reviewed our benchmarks of quality or our TFI, to put some action steps in place around that. The next part we want to do is we want to identify some positive school-wide behavioral expectations. And so with these, we want them to be stated 3 to 5, positively stated. As Heather said earlier, tier 1 is for everyone, everywhere. So you can see some different things that some schools have done here. The one at the top in the left-hand corner, every Turner Tiger will. They've translated their expectations into Spanish. They have a big population of students who speak Spanish, so they wanted those students to access it. The one in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the charter school, that is on one of the Indian reservations here in Florida. So they went to the elders of the tribe and asked them for some input about what are some of the values of the tribe that they could input with their expectations. So those are just 2 examples of making it culturally responsive. I trained a high school last week. I'm very excited. They have come up with a survey that they are sending to every staff member for some feedback about the expectations. And they've also drafted some surveys for students and family members. And they're thinking of some different formats of how to get that information out to their families and students for them to be able to give some input about what those expectations will look like. So we have another poll for you. And in that poll, we want to know if your school has positively stated expectations. And that is poll number 7. I'll give you a couple seconds to vote on poll number 7 about, does your school have expectations? And then we can discuss the results. Now, keeping in mind too, you probably won't change your expectations. When we don't talk about changing expectations frequently, but what we do talk about is how we define those. So I know a lot of schools in the United States now have some sort of virtual format as well. So one of the things we might want to consider is, how do these expectations look like if we are doing a virtual model or hybrid model? Looks like Heather's getting the poll up. It looks like the majority of the schools do have expectations at 61%, but 30% of the participants say that they probably need to be revised. So if anybody wants to put in the chat box and the apps about what that would look like or why you think they need to be revised, that would be some great information to have. Keep in mind, sometimes our schools do need to revise them because they know that they haven't gotten that faculty, staff, student, and family buy-in. Once we have those expectations, then we need to think about teaching those school-wide expectations. So here are some examples of some different ways schools have been teaching those expectations. One of the recommendations that we have is taking the students to the settings where they will be displaying those behaviors so they can actually practice it in real life settings. We also want to try to get the students as much involved as possible in developing those. So we have a lot of schools that have had student clubs come up with lesson plans. We've gotten a lot of the middle schools and high schools that I know where the drama club or the tech club actually does videos and puts those there. If you haven't ever participated in the APBS forum, there is a film festival that takes place every year, and those videos are amazing. So if you want to look for some samples of videos, there are some there that you could use as samples to show your students, and then they could develop your own school ones. There's one in there called Go Flush, Wash, Leave for the bathroom. I love it. It's a great video. I can even sing the song in my head, which was developed by a school in Arizona many, many years ago, and probably the students in the video have probably graduated from high school, but it's an oldie but goodie. We think about having a teaching matrix, and so here's an example of that. It tells us for the expectations, what do those behaviors look like in those settings? So this is one of those that probably may need to be revised frequently, especially with the way things are going on with kids coming and going. So we might have new safety procedures for arrival at school if you have to have a mask or temperature checks. They may be changed based on what your school is doing. So for example, I know some of our elementary schools here in Florida, lunch is no longer in the cafeteria. So what does lunch look like in the classroom now instead of in the cafeteria? So they may need to be changed based on what's going on. Here are some other examples of what those look like. And so here are some different settings. We've got the water fountain, we've got classrooms, and we have cafeteria. One of the things that we talk about in Florida with the classroom is that we want to give some autonomy to the teachers because, you know, we teach different grade levels, we teach different content areas, we have different learning styles. Making sure that we have those expectations and then maybe giving some flexibility to teachers to what those actually look like in the classroom. On the bottom left-hand corner, the one that says be safe, be responsible, be respectful, be there, is a district here in Florida that actually came up with some district-wide expectations and then defined what it looks like, not only for students, but also for teachers at the school, administrators at the school, all district personnel, and for families. So developing procedures for classroom or class-wide expectations, like I said, we want to give some teachers some of that autonomy. So we might give them a blank matrix that has the expectations that are school-wide on there. And then the teachers get to identify which routines that they need some definitions for, and then they describe what that looks like in their classroom. So here's just a couple of examples of those. So I love it when we can see that the students have really been involved with the developing that with the teachers. We know basic research around classroom management, the more students are involved, the more likely they are to participate. You'll also notice that there was one teacher in there that had it translated in Spanish so all the students could access that as well. So there's tons of resources out there for classroom. One of the great ones up there is supporting and responding to behavior. It has tons of practices across elementary and secondary to help teachers. It's a free resource that is out there. There's another one, which is the PBIS technical brief that talks about the different systems. And then the other one up there in the top right-hand corner is about some data. And all of those are hyperlinked and you can find them there. Another one, I know Dr. George Shagai during the keynote and Heather talked about earlier that there are some new resources out there from the center. So here's another one that you might want to consider to look at as students are returning to school after crisis. I know every school and every district is a little bit different how they're doing that. I know I saw in a state today that starting the end of mid-November, they're going to start allowing kindergarten students to come back 2 days a week. And then they're going to add different grade levels through December and January. A lot of our school districts in Florida, the students have choices about virtual versus face-to-face. So it might be an instance where you're having students returning throughout the school year. So it would be great to have some different systems in place. Also, thinking about how we're supporting our students with disabilities as well. And here's another really good one too for adapting check-in, check-out for distance learning. Here's some other additional resources. These are new to the Florida PBIS website, and they cover all the 5 different areas based on our matrix. We've also included here a little visual about virtual rewards for elementary school students. We do have one for secondary students as well. Those are things that could be done school-wide or in individual classrooms. The last couple ones real quick, we want to make sure that we have some procedures for encouraging the behaviors that we want to see. So thinking about the different types of rewards, incentives, reinforcement programs that we have in place, they look different across the different ways. We do have schools who like to do some group contingency rewards and also that like to do individual rewards, making sure that we have things that address all interests and needs of the students. And again, this is another great area where you can get some input from everybody about that. We did a survey once at one school and asked the families what they would like to see their students rewarded with, and they said positive referrals and phone calls home. We know sometimes that we have our staff who say, well, I shouldn't have to reward students. They should automatically behave. The real world doesn't do that. I will beg to differ. Heather has included in here because she travels on Southwest so much. They want to encourage her to continue to fly on Southwest, that she had earned a list preferred member. So if you're not aware of that, that means you get to be one of, I think it's the first 15 people on the airplane. So you get your preferred seat. I know that's a pretty big deal when it's open seating. So yes, the real world does it for adults. So we can do it for our students regardless of age. We also want to think about not just our students, but how do we recognize our staff as well? So here's an example of recognizing a teacher at the school. And we've also had schools here in Florida where they want to encourage the behaviors they want to see with families involvement. And they've done some different things with families here. One school in particular had a family parent store. They had a lot of families in transition and they got a lot of donations. And parents could earn that opportunity to get things from that parent store. And it was a lot of times things that they could not necessarily afford or have access to. So lots of different examples on here. We know even though we are having expectations and rules, we're going to be ongoing teaching that to the students. We're ongoing to reward our students for displaying the appropriate behavior. There will still be times where students don't follow our expectations or don't follow the rules. So we do need to have some procedures in place of what are we going to do to discourage students from breaking the expectations and rules. And so here's the sample flow chart from a school here in Florida. We talk about minors or classroom managed behaviors and office or office managed behaviors or majors. So here are the procedures that this one specific school had laid out to work with their staff to know what the procedures were if they were to observe a student and know which behaviors would be handled by them in the classroom and provide them some steps to follow versus something that would be handled by the office and the steps to follow there as well. We often have a lot of schools, specifically at elementary school, who use a clip chart system. There's been a lot of discussion and research about how clip charts actually are not effective and they are shameful to the students. So if that's a source of contention and you still have some staff members who are really married to using a clip system or a chart system, here's a great resource that you can share. I'll put it up there. So PBIS overall is a positive system, but even though we do have those positive systems, we do need to have some strategies when things do not go as planned. Here are some different examples of low cost, easy reinforcement systems. So one is about, we want to increase the attendance we want to see, so they have goals. A positive character referral, or a lot of times in secondary schools, we call them positive referrals. And at the bottom, that happened many years ago, but a student won at one of our local high schools to have the rapper Ludacris come in and do a free concert at the school through MTV, and the principal allowed it. They had certain standards for language that could be used, and that's her giving the rap artist one of their PBIS t-shirts with their expectations. The last couple ones real quick, before I turn it back over to Heather, is number 10, using data. So there's multiple data sources that we want to look at. You probably have or may have heard about the big five. So those are referrals by location, time of day, problem behavior, monthly referral rate. So what are the data that are occurring? That data specialist at your team member is the person that'll probably be bringing that up. We have different other types of data sources that we might want to drill in. Is there a race or ethnicity that we see that's getting most of our referrals? Disproportionality? What about students with disabilities? We also want to share that data back with our staff, our families, and our students. So here's a sample of a data chat wall that's being used maybe to share the data with their staff. I know sharing it with families and students may be scary, but there was a middle school I worked with, and when you walked in, they had a data chat wall that had both their academic and their behavioral data. Didn't have teacher names, didn't have students' names, but gave some overall data. There is a middle school I work with that does a weekly update on their data, and they compare the data from the week before to this week. They also compare the data from this month to last month. They have a goal to get more positive referrals than office discipline referrals, and that's included on there. And when they have more positive referrals over office referrals, they get a great shout out on there. And so that's a template they've done. Once we have the data that we're looking at, we really want to drill down to find out a problem statement of what is the specific area or behavior or time of day of concern on our campus. So here's our next poll number 8. And so we just want to know, do you currently have access to a data system that allows your school to drill down into your discipline data? So do you have a district data system that allows you to pull your data to drill it down in this way to really define the problem? So Heather's pulled the results of that poll up, and it looks like overwhelmingly about 37% that the data system that your school currently has does allow you to drill that into your discipline data, and they're currently using it. Followed closely by no or I don't know, I'm unsure. If you are one of those that says that your district system does not allow you to drill into your discipline data, there are lots of options out there. One of them is talking to your district to see what can be done with IT, MIS, IT, whichever department your district has, to see if there's a possibility of drilling into your data that way to see if it can be built in. There are other options, paid programs out there that you can purchase that could be used to do that as well. So then we want to develop database procedures for monitoring, our systems. Backwards. Then we want to develop a system to support our staff. So we want to think about, okay, we're asking our staff to buy into PBS, to adopt PBIS, but we need to provide some supports to help them. So sometimes our schools will develop a PBIS PLC, and within that, they developed the expectations and use the expectations that were school-wide in there. We want to make sure we're getting feedback from our staff over time about PBIS. So here's an interesting survey that some of our schools have done. They survey the staff about their perceptions about what is the biggest problem at the school, and the staff respond. And then we show them what the actual data shows to see if it's similar or different. And if you look at it, the terms disrespect and defiance could be overlapping. I think it just depends whoever's answering the survey and how they define those. So it could be a great discussion to talk about. The next ones are teasing and tardy and skipping. You know, maybe a lot of people say tardy, the data shows skipping because we don't maybe collect a lot of referrals on tardies, and teachers feel and have that impact. But it also could be a difference of definition. At what point at a middle school or high school when a student's late to class, is it tardy versus skipping? So some really good discussions. Some other ways of asking what worked. And so here's another option of what worked and getting some feedback from our staff. And then there's that PBS update that I talked about that the school does weekly. So PBIS is relationship based. We really are trying to build the relationships with our staff to students, students to students, and also staff to families. So here's just some different examples of ways that have been done to do that as well. In the top right-hand corner, that says a reintegration flowchart. That is something that we could also work on to think about, when students are removed from school or a classroom and they return, how can we make sure that we're setting them up for success? And we want to have some positive relationships when they return. Teaching SEL is another one for relationship building. It's one of the domains also in CASEL if your district follows that. The last couple ones I'm going to talk about is having a system to increase family and community engagement. We, of course, want to infuse it throughout, but here are some different strategies. If you haven't seen it, this Wisconsin PBIS network has a home matrix that can be done. So there's a blank one, and then there's a sample one on the right-hand corner. And that could be something that's developed with your family. I know I've done that at home before, and I think Heather has probably too, and getting the families involved. Some different examples. Here are some different resources that are available if you are trying to increase your involvement with families, and especially around MTSS. The first one is a glossary of terms, which is very probably helpful because sometimes families are not as familiar with the language that we use. There's another one. The second one is tips for how to share data with families, and so is the third one. Some additional resources put up there for working with families that are from the Center on PBIS. Again, we're going to give you a lot of resources on there. So here are some different ones. The first two are from the Center from PBIS. You see the one is also translated in Spanish. And then the other two are from our Florida PBIS network. We did a whole series of webinars during the summer with COVID about supporting families at home during virtual learning. So there's a whole series for families on using PBIS at home. There's some handouts to go along with those, and some of them are translated into Spanish as well. So thinking about too, we keep talking about having expectations and buy-in across everywhere. And so just a reminder too that we not only have expectations at school, but there's also expectations in the community. And so you might see those as well and make that connection to families, especially if you see some of those in your community, so they can see how they cut across all types of settings. And the last of the ones I'm going to talk about is building in routines. So thinking throughout the year what you want to do for implementation. So here's just an example of a school that has taken their action plan they've developed for the year, and then they've laid out what they're doing across every month for data review, planning, implementation, and family and community involvement. This is, again, we've got the links of where you can find it on the computer. Just some additional resources, and I'm going to turn that back to you, Heather.
All right, so how many of you have your head spinning right now? It was a lot of information, wasn't it? One of the things I forgot to tell you about is that typically we do this getting started session when we are face-to-face. It's a 75-minute session, but it's two 75-minute sessions. There's a part one and a part two. So we had condensed it and put it all into 75 minutes. So if your head is spinning, it makes perfect sense. So we are trying to give you all of the nuts and bolts of everything of how to get that foundation established at the school, what to know that's involved with it, but also how you can go pretty quickly to get resources and various tools to assist you in opening up some of these conversations with some of your stakeholders. So I just want to, in summary, and if you guys are starting to have questions as you're digesting everything that Stephanie went through, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, because we've got plenty of time to answer your questions now. I want you to think about, in some, when we're looking at, and schools are implementing PBIS, regardless of where you're coming from, if you're at that state level, you're supporting districts that have all the schools. And if you're coming from that district level, you're supporting all of your schools within your district. And you're coming in as an administrator, you got to think about, you've got to be supporting all of your classrooms. So we've got to think about how we're regularly checking our effectiveness of our practices that we're using. Just because something costs a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean it's effective, or doesn't necessarily mean that it's being implemented as it was originally designed. And so you might not be getting the results that you want. So I think the part to think about is that nobody's exempt in this process. Honestly, if we want kids to be able to be making improvements, to be able to, be behaving in class, being able to have their, eyes open, ears open, and listening to learn, we as adults have got to be able to create that space for them and also model that for them. We've got schools in Florida that have been considered in this category, I guess they'd say blue ribbon or A schools. They're phenomenal related to their academics, but if they start to see that there's going to be zoning changes or there's going to be a big change in their faculty members, a lot of folks are retiring, they want to be proactive and preventative. And they're like, we need a framework so that we can respond most appropriately and effectively to support all of our kids and our teachers across our campus. So some of the things to think about is that, PBIS is that framework. And so you're going to be pulling from a range of evidence-based interventions that you see based upon your data are most needed to support your students' needs on your campus. When we're talking about multi-tiered support systems, it's content neutral because we're talking about setting up this framework, having a clear process in how we're identifying kids or classrooms that are needing more support or schools, and then getting in there and making sure that we're responding to that. Not every single evidence-based intervention that's selected at a school is going to be used all at the other school. Again, it's depending on what that data and the needs are. Another thing to think about is that content expertise. We've got to have ongoing coaching or technical assistance to support our classroom teachers. That ongoing professional development. We know enough that just sending folks to training is not enough. It's something, but we also got to be able to get in there and provide those supports ongoing with the teachers so they can kind of problem solve, talk through it, because we know that when we hear stuff in training, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. I can do that. And then you get out there and you're like, wait, what am I supposed to do again? Wait, they didn't talk about this issue coming up. So we need that networking. Think about relying on your team. Most of you had said that there's so many initiatives that you guys are engaging in, but you don't have that collaborative team effort. And so we've got to think about how can you start to build your team overall. We know that leadership commits and works together in this process, but as classroom teachers, you're the leaders within that classroom too. But sometimes we've got to figure out how do we band together all of our, maybe our grade level teachers. If you're engaged in team level meetings, that would be a great way starting to bring your team together. Thinking of implementing those universal screening practices. There's a lot of tools out there. A lot of them are costly. There's a lot of them that are free. They still can be equally effective, but we've got to have a method in which we are screening kids, getting them the help early as opposed to waiting until it's too late. The other thing is using that piece of data that prevention is always key in this process. People need to know and have the skills and how to respond to problem behavior, but the more that we can kind of set things up early in this process, we actually can prevent behaviors from occurring. I think a great example of prevention is driver's ed. And I can talk specifically as having 2 teenagers in my household, but there's something to be said about driver's ed and the expectations, and you're driving on the right hand side of the road, and what turning your signal on to be able to communicate to other folks. There's a reason why we have that over the years, because before they had actual rules of the road, there were accidents all over the place because people did whatever they wanted to do. So again, our goal is to prevent, but we also need to make sure that we have a plan and skills in the hands of folks when behaviors or problems do occur. And the other thing too is to think about how you can include your community members. So if you're a principal, your community members are also your teachers, they're also your students, but they're also your family members and your businesses that are out there, because the goal is you want to create something that's culturally relevant to your area, to your school, and to the needs of your folks that are at your school. So like I said, one size does not fit all. We need to be flexible in our implementation, but PBIS provides that framework so it all works more smoothly. Some other resources for you. You know, Stephanie had talked about how many of you are using the measurement tool, either the benchmarks equality or the tiered fidelity inventory. And a lot of you said, I don't know, or we're not using one, which makes sense. If you're just starting, you wouldn't have one. Based upon the benchmarks equality, which is reliable with the TFI, we've got some resources to help implement those tier 1 critical elements in the virtual environment. So we don't have to be face-to-face to truly engage and have a PBIS system in place. And so here's something, because we're all in this hybrid motion depending on where we are across the country. Some of you may still have children at home that are virtually on and might be getting kicked off in this process while they're logging into their Zoom meetings. But we need to know is, as teachers, there are still things we can do. We can still team, we can still use data. We have to adjust things a bit with the virtual, but we can still screen for engagement, screen to see how kids are responding, and we need to make sure we're setting up clear expectations too for the students when they're things are a little bit different when they're not in that physical classroom. And again, you can always click directly on those pictures that Stephanie had shared with you to get directly to those resources. The resources we shared with you from the Florida project are all available on this website here. And so I really recommend you go check that out. If you have questions, you can certainly send us an email. Another thing too for getting started is sometimes folks will say, well, what's the research out there? Or does it work? And I want you to know that your state has a very good possibility of already having a state evaluation report of what they have done related to PBIS. We tend to have most of this stuff up on the National Center, but check out your state project. Check out if they've got the results up there, what they have been doing. We do know that there's PBIS activity in every single state. We do have somebody identified as a PBIS coordinator in your state. So if you go to the national site, you can pull that up. And if you go directly to that link, it will take you to who your state coordinator is, and you can ask them directly. But I know to find out exactly how the impact is with PBIS in your state, that can sometimes help you get more stakeholders to come to the table to get this going at your school and district. This is my contact information. Again, our other George Sagai had spoken during the keynote today. These are my other co-PIs and co-directors of our National Center and their contact information too. Also, we are on Twitter and Facebook for the Center of PBIS. And we've been funded since 1997, so we are officially starting year 23 as of October 1st this year. Also, just to give you guys a heads up, there is an international association on positive behavior support. And positive behavior support, there's an actual science around it. There's over 30 years of research around that. And PBIS adds in the intervention piece is specific what we're doing kind of pre-K through grade 12, but it is founded on that science of positive behavior support. But I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. So wherever you're logging in, if you are outside of the US, there are networks that are established across the world around positive behavior support. Some are might be thematic, such as home and community, or it might be a student network, but you don't have to necessarily be regionally based to be part of that network, because the beauty of APBS is a virtual, has always been a virtual organization. So I think they may have been ahead of the game and were able to adapt much, much faster during the pandemic. But just know that there's resources out there for you so you never feel like you're alone. For those of you that are at the high school level, just know that there's an opportunity for you to participate in a research project that they're doing related to college and career readiness. This is in your handouts. You can go directly to it. There is a pretty nice stipend that goes along with it of $5,000. So again, it's only for high school level, but just know that it's a great opportunity. So now is the time for us to answer any additional questions. Our contact information is on the very last slide here, and this is our families across the board, from our Florida project to our national center to Stephanie's and my kids, that help keep us in line constantly and remind us whether we are being good stewards of PBIS or not. So, because we're all having to work together and remind each other. But what I'd like to do is, if there's additional questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we would be happy to continue answering them.
And I know there's two, Heather, that Betsy has sent us in the Zoom chat for us as presenters. So I'm going to read them and we can answer them. So one of them is about aligning behaviors that are appropriate on an academic setting, but maybe not appropriate in a cultural or community setting. And how do we handle that? So a lot of times, and I know Kent McIntosh will talk about this too, is when we talk about what those expectations look like on our school setting, we might say something like, these are our expectations of what this looks like at our specific school setting, which may differ from your home and your community. And asking kids, so we're talking about responsibility at school, what does that responsibility look at home? Maybe at the community center, at your football team, and letting them know it may switch from place to place, and that's called code switching. So having the students identify how those specific behaviors may look different in different settings and telling them it's okay. You know, I had to have a long talk. One of the pictures Heather just had up was my son. And when he was about 5, as most boys do, he learned how to make those fart noises with his mouth and armpit. I don't love it, but I tolerate it because he was a 5-year-old boy. And so we had a long discussion about how he was allowed to do it at home, but couldn't do it at school because he would get in trouble. He got that. So then when it came to spring break time, he had a whole week off. I let him come to work with me one day. And what do you think he did? Well, he started with the fart noises. So we had to close the door, and I had to tell him, you know, at mommy's work, it's kind of like school. You can't really make those fart noises. He said, okay. Neglect on my part to pre-teach him that up front. So all day long, he did a really good job of not making those noises. What do you think happened as soon as we got in the car? It was the whole way home. It was like a whole fart language. But that was something that I tolerate. Some families may not tolerate that. That's okay with me. So letting our students know how to do that code switching. And if you're a parent, how do you teach your child to code switch, but based on settings? So that was one. There's another one about getting student voice on what the school-wide expectations should be. That is a great question. There's actually a brief on the Center on PBIS about student voice. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what some schools have done. Some of the schools have done things like a survey, and they ask a open-ended survey, you know, what should we call it? They called it a model student. So what does a model student look like at our school? And it was open-ended. I've had some say, what does a model student look like at our school? And they give choices, and then there's other, and the students can fill it in. When we do our training, we used to do an activity called What's an Ideal Student? And I've seen some schools take that and do that with their students. So the students in a homeroom setting or a morning meeting do that, and then they collect it. And as a team, they go through the answers. One of the coolest ones I know is in California. There's a high school where they have their school-wide expectations. They're consistent from school year to school year, but how they're defined changes every 4 years. Because as you know, every 4 years, we have a new group of students. So those group of students define what those expectations look like across the settings. They use that same matrix for 4 years. And then after 4 years, when they have a group of brand new students, so new freshmen, new sophomore, juniors, and seniors, they do that again.
Stephanie, looking at the chat box, thanks for that. Kylie had asked if we could talk more about the college and career readiness grant for the high schools. I can't directly because the slide was just sent to us to include, but my recommendation is you go straight to that slide and send your direct question to the folks, and they will probably have a more intensive flyer for you. One of the other questions had to do with approaching the roles for the PBIS team. Something I want you guys to think about is that you know your staff and faculty best. And so, you know, if you've got somebody who is a great leader and has the respect of your faculty, they'd probably be an ideal person to put on that team. But you also want to make sure that you're not rewarding somebody who's a great worker with more work. So we've got to think about, okay, we don't want to be duplicating efforts. If we're going to ask them to be a part of our team, what can we take off their plate in this process? And that's where you really need the support with the administrator. But I think there's also sometimes folks that I've seen schools assign people that might be traditional naysayers in the process, because they realize that once those folks understand and they buy into, like, they understand the process, they can see it, they're going to buy into it, and they'll be a great spokesperson for it. So, so you can go many ways. Again, please send us additional questions you can, I believe, through the Pathables, through our links. All of the files are there. If you go to the file box, you can download all of them, and it all should be able to be, like I said, hyperlinked in our contact information. And if you want to know the extended part 1 and part 2 of Getting Started, that is available on the national site. It's been videotaped as of last year. So, and you can keep watching this one over and over. This recorded version is available in 10 minutes. It's going to be instantly populated, we've been told, where you can watch it again right away. We are going to be then moving them the next 2 weeks up on the national PBIS site, where they will be free for everybody to view and across all sessions.
And Heather, there was one last question I wanted to address real quickly about how to get supports to be a PBIS school. So I just wanted to say that this PBIS.org, if you go on that website, at the very top, there's some tabs. One says PBIS. There's a drop down Getting Started. It walks you through Getting Started. And then at the very bottom, there's a link that will tell you who your contact is for your state. So if you're not sure who that contact is, and then they can direct you if they are working with your school district. So in Florida it would be Heather, but for another state it would probably be someone different. So if you're trying to figure that out, that's a great resource on PBIS.org.
And we are 1 minute past our time. So again, here's our contact information. Feel free to reach out, and good luck to you guys. Just know that you are not alone, and everybody has started at some point in their process, and you can do it. And we look forward to hearing from you. So good luck and enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you.
Okay, ladies, I think I just end the session now. Unless there's anything else that we need to do. We're good? Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Heather.
Great job, Stephanie and Betsy.
Great job. You guys did awesome. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.